A teacher mocked my kid because I was a garbage collector. So I got her teaching license revoked. I've been working for the city sanitation department for 12 years. Make $85,000 a year with overtime, full benefits, pension, the whole deal. My son Tommy started 3rd grade this year at the local elementary school. Kid was excited about everything. New backpack, new shoes, couldn't wait to meet his teacher. First few weeks went great. Tommy came home talking about math games and science experiments. Then they had career day coming up, and kids were supposed to bring a parent to talk about their job. Tommy asked me immediately, made me practice my presentation about how sanitation workers keep cities healthy and prevent disease. He thought the garbage truck was the coolest thing ever. Week before career day, Tommy came home quiet. Said his teacher, Mrs. Diane, told him maybe his mom should come instead since she worked in an office. His mom and I are divorced but co-parent fine. She works part-time as a receptionist. Tommy wanted me there because he loved hearing about the trucks and routes. I told him I'd be there no matter what. The day before career day, I got a call from Mrs. Diane. She said she was concerned about my presentation, asked if I could maybe say I worked in waste management or environmental services instead of saying garbage collector. Said some parents might be uncomfortable. I asked why anyone would be uncomfortable. She said we needed to maintain certain standards and appearances. I said I'd present honestly about my job. She sighed and said she hoped I'd dress appropriately at least. Career day arrived and I wore my work uniform. Clean and pressed, but still my uniform. Tommy was so proud when I walked in. Other parents were there in suits and medical scrubs and business clothes. Mrs. Diane's face when she saw me was pure disgust. She put me last on the presentation list. Every other parent went first. The doctor, the lawyer, the marketing executive, even the stay-at-home mom who talked about managing a household. When it was finally my turn, Mrs. Diane introduced me as Tommy's father who worked in the sanitation field. Not my name, not my actual job title. Tommy corrected her immediately and said his dad was a garbage collector. Mrs. Diane actually told the class that garbage collector wasn't the preferred term. I did my presentation anyway, showed pictures of the trucks, explained how we keep the city clean, talked about recycling. The kids loved it, asked tons of questions about the truck controls and what weird stuff I'd found. Tommy was beaming. Mrs. Diane cut me off after 10 minutes saying we were out of time, even though the lawyer had talked for 20. After that day, things got worse for Tommy. Mrs. Diane started making comments. When Tommy forgot his homework, she said maybe his dad couldn't help him with it anyway. When teaching about community helpers, she said some jobs were more important than others while looking at Tommy. During a lesson on hygiene, she said some people's parents worked dirty jobs and those kids needed to wash extra careful. Tommy started coming home crying. Other kids began repeating what Mrs. Diane said, calling his dad the trash man, saying he probably smelled bad. Tommy stopped wanting me to pick him up from school. I reached out to Mrs. Diane for a meeting. She said she was too busy but sent an email saying Tommy seemed sensitive lately and maybe he needed counseling. Suggested his home situation might be affecting him. The home situation where his dad was a garbage man. I went to the principal who said Mrs. Diane was a respected teacher with 20 years experience. Said kids could be cruel and it probably wasn't about my job. Told me Tommy might be misinterpreting things. Then I discovered something interesting. Mrs. Diane had been claiming she had a master's degree in education from a prestigious university, had it on her classroom wall and everything, but when I checked with the university, they had no record of her graduating. She'd attended but never finished. Her teaching license was based on false credentials she'd submitted 20 years ago. I compiled everything. The false degree, the discriminatory comments witnessed by multiple parents, the emotional distress caused to my son, gave it all to a friend who worked at the school board. Also gave it to a reporter who'd been investigating credential fraud in the district. The story broke the same week as the school's big fundraising gala. The gala was in full swing when phones started buzzing. I stood near the bar watching Mrs. Diane in her black cocktail dress, talking to some donors about the new library fundraising goal. People started checking their phones and the energy in the room shifted. Faces went from polite smiles to confusion to shock. Someone near me pulled up the news article on their tablet, and I saw the headline about credential fraud at the elementary school. Mrs. Diane's name was right there in the first paragraph. The principal spotted me across the room and her face went pale. She moved through the crowd toward Mrs. Diane, who was still chatting away, completely unaware. When the principal touched her elbow and leaned in to whisper something, Mrs. Diane's expression changed from confident to confused to absolutely white. Her champagne glass trembled in her hand. The school board president stepped up to the microphone and tapped it twice. The room went quiet except for the continued buzzing of phones. He cleared his throat and said the district was aware of serious allegations regarding staff credentials and conduct. Said a full investigation would begin immediately. Said they took these matters with the utmost seriousness. Mrs. Diane set down her glass and grabbed her purse. She walked toward the exit with her head down while people whispered and stared. I watched her leave and felt nothing, but relief that this was finally happening. Monday morning came and I kept Tommy home from the school, wanted to see how the administration would handle things before sending him back into that environment. Around 9:30, my phone rang with the school's number. The principal's voice sounded tired when she asked if we could meet in person. Said she owed me an apology and wanted to discuss how the district would move forward. I agreed to come in that afternoon after she confirmed Mrs. Diane had been placed on administrative leave. Tommy had a substitute teacher starting today. When I arrived at the school, the principal's office felt different from last time. She stood up when I walked in and actually shook my hand, gestured for me to sit down. She admitted she should have taken my concerns seriously instead of dismissing them. Said she'd been wrong to protect Mrs. Diane based solely on her years of service. The district was launching a full review of her credentials and conduct. I told her I appreciated the apology, but what I really wanted was real consequences and better systems to protect students going forward. Not just words, but actual policy changes. She nodded and said the superintendent was already working on new protocols for reporting and investigating discrimination complaints. I made it clear I'd be watching to make sure they followed through. That evening, Tommy asked what was happening with Mrs. Diane. I sat down with him at the kitchen table and explained in simple terms that she hadn't been honest about her education, that she'd lied about having a certain degree and the school found out. I also told him she'd treated him unfairly because of my job and that wasn't okay. Tommy's shoulders relaxed a little bit. He said it felt good that grown-ups finally believed him. But then he got quiet and asked what the other kids were saying. I could see the worry in his face. I told him he didn't do anything wrong. That standing up when someone treats you badly is important even when it's hard. That some kids might not understand right away, but the truth was on his side. He nodded slowly and seemed to feel a bit better. The reporter's follow-up story came out 2 days later. This one had statements from 2 other parents who'd witnessed Mrs. Diane's comments during career day and at parent-teacher conferences. One parent said her husband was a mechanic, and Mrs. Diane had made similar remarks about blue-collar limitations affecting their daughter's potential. She'd told them their daughter was smart, but might struggle with advanced coursework because of her home environment. The other parent reported that Mrs. Diane had questioned whether their son's father, who worked construction, could really help with science fair projects. The pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't about one bad day or misunderstandings. This was systematic bias against working-class families. The story included quotes from education experts about how teacher prejudice impacts student achievement. The district couldn't ignore it anymore. The university released an official statement confirming that Mrs. Diane had attended their graduate program 20 years ago, but withdrew after 1 semester. She never completed the coursework or received a master's degree. The district's HR director had to hold a press conference explaining how this wasn't caught during initial hiring. Turns out they'd only verified that she'd been accepted to the program, not that she'd graduated. For 20 years, nobody had double-checked. Now they were reviewing credentials for all staff members. The HR director looked sick during the press conference, said this was an unacceptable failure of their verification systems. Parents were demanding to know how many other teachers might have false credentials. The superintendent announced that 3 administrators in HR were being reassigned pending the investigation. This was bigger than just Mrs. Diane now. Tommy went back to the school on Wednesday with a substitute teacher named Rodriguez. When I picked him up that afternoon, he actually seemed happy. Started talking about how the new teacher had asked each student what their parents did for work. Told the class that every single job matters to make society function. That sanitation workers and doctors and teachers and mechanics all contribute something important. Tommy said it felt weird to talk about my job without feeling embarrassed. Rodriguez had shown genuine interest and asked Tommy questions about the recycling process. For the first time in months, Tommy came home with a positive school story. I could see some of the tension leaving his body. He wasn't hunched over anymore when he talked about his day. Mrs. Diane's lawyer released a statement the next day, called the credential issue an honest mistake from 2 decades ago, said any comments about students had been taken out of context, claimed she'd always treated all children with respect and dignity. The response was immediate and angry. Parents flooded the school's Facebook page and email system demanding her termination, said the evidence was clear and the excuses were insulting. Someone started an online petition calling for her permanent removal that got 1,500 signatures in 2 days. The local news interviewed parents outside the school who said they'd lost trust in the administration. The community wasn't buying the lawyer's spin. Too many people had witnessed her behavior firsthand. The school board scheduled an emergency meeting for the following Monday. I got a call asking me to provide testimony along with the other affected parents. I took the day off work and put on clean jeans and a button-down shirt. The meeting room was packed with parents and press. I sat at the table facing the board members and presented everything calmly. The false credentials with documentation from the university. The discriminatory comments with dates and witnesses. The impact on Tommy and other students, including his declining grades and anxiety. I brought the emails where Mrs. Diane had suggested Tommy needed counseling because of his home situation. I stayed factual and let the evidence speak for itself. The board members looked genuinely disturbed. One of them asked detailed questions about the timeline. Another wanted to know why the principal hadn't acted on my initial complaint. I answered everything directly. The other parents gave similar testimony about their experiences. The mechanic's wife broke down crying while describing how her daughter had started saying she was stupid because her family wasn't fancy enough. 3 days after the board meeting, the district issued a press release. Mrs. Diane's employment was terminated effective immediately. They were forwarding all evidence of credential fraud to the state licensing board for review. The district was also implementing new verification procedures for all teacher credentials and mandatory training on discrimination and bias for all staff. Every employee would go through updated background checks and credential verification within 60 days. They were creating a new position for a diversity and inclusion coordinator. It was more action than I'd expected this fast. The superintendent's statement said the district failed Tommy and other students, that they took full responsibility and were committed to making sure this never happened again. I read the statement twice to make sure it was real. Tommy was in the living room playing with his trucks. I called him over and told him Mrs. Diane wouldn't be his teacher anymore, that she wouldn't be anyone's teacher anymore. He looked at me for a long moment and then hugged me tight. Said he was glad it was over. I told him I was proud of him for being brave through all of this, that things were going to get better now. The next week, Tommy's mother and I scheduled a meeting with Mr. Rodriguez after school to check in on how things were going. We sat in those small plastic chairs at the kid-sized table while Mr. Rodriguez pulled up Tommy's folder. He smiled and said Tommy was doing really well, said he'd been working hard to catch up on assignments he'd struggled with during the previous months. Mr. Rodriguez explained he'd been pairing Tommy with supportive classmates for group work, and the social dynamics were improving every day. Tommy was participating more in class discussions and seemed more comfortable raising his hand. The meeting lasted about 20 minutes and we left feeling relieved. Tommy's mother squeezed my hand in the parking lot and said she was glad we'd fought back. 2 weeks after that, I got a notification on my phone from the local news app. The state licensing board had officially notified Mrs. Diane that her teaching license was revoked for credential fraud and conduct unbecoming of an educator. She had the right to appeal, but the article quoted her lawyer saying she wouldn't be fighting it. Her teaching career was over. I read the article twice to make sure it was real. 20 years of teaching built on a lie, and it all came crashing down because she couldn't treat a kid with basic respect. I showed Tommy the article that evening and explained what it meant. He nodded quietly, and then went back to his homework. He didn't say much, but I could see his shoulders relax a little. The phone calls and emails started coming in over the next few days. Parents from Tommy's class reached out to thank me for speaking up. One mom said her son had also felt uncomfortable with Mrs. Diane's comments, but she didn't realize it was a pattern until everything came out. A dad admitted he should have said something sooner when Mrs. Diane made a snide remark about his job as an electrician during a parent-teacher conference. Another parent said their daughter had been scared to tell them what was happening in class. The support from other families helped Tommy feel less isolated about what happened. He started talking more about school again without that worried look on his face. The principal called me in for another meeting a month later. She'd implemented a new system where students could report concerns about teacher behavior anonymously through an online form. There was now a dedicated counselor whose job was to follow up on every single complaint within 48 hours. She asked if I would serve on a parent advisory committee for school climate and inclusion. Said they needed parents who weren't afraid to speak up when something was wrong. I agreed because I wanted to help make sure this didn't happen to other kids. The first meeting was scheduled for the following month, and I marked it on my calendar. Tommy slowly started talking about my job with pride again, though he was more cautious about it than before. One afternoon, he came home and told me a classmate had asked what I did for work. Tommy said he'd answered that his dad was a sanitation worker, and it was actually really important. Defensive but honest. I could see he was rebuilding his confidence, but the experience had left marks. He didn't volunteer information about my job the way he used to. Didn't bring it up unless someone asked directly. But at least he wasn't ashamed anymore. I heard through the parent network that Mrs. Diane tried to get a job at a private school in the next county. Apparently word had spread fast in the education community, and they rejected her application once they checked her references. The reporter who broke the original story did a follow-up piece about how credential fraud has consequences beyond just losing one job. How the teaching community takes these violations seriously and shares information. The article mentioned Mrs. Diane by name and detailed how her career was truly finished. No school would hire someone with a revoked license and a public record of discrimination. 3 months after Mrs. Diane's termination, the district reached out about a settlement. They offered to cover the cost of counseling services for Tommy and the other affected kids, plus a formal written apology. It wasn't about money for me, but I appreciated that they were taking responsibility. Tommy had been seeing a counselor every other week who helped him process what happened. The counselor said he was doing well and developing healthy coping strategies. The settlement covered all of his therapy sessions for the rest of the year. I signed the paperwork and filed it away. Mr. Rodriguez got hired as Tommy's permanent teacher for the rest of the year in April. The difference in classroom environment was night and day. Tommy brought home artwork about community helpers, where he'd drawn me on the garbage truck with a big smile on my face. Mr. Rodriguez had written across the top in red marker that Tommy's dad helps keep our city healthy. I hung it on the refrigerator next to his spelling tests and math quizzes. Tommy stood there looking at it for a minute, and then hugged me before running off to play. 6 months after everything started, Tommy was doing well in the school again. His grades were back up to where they'd been at the beginning of the year. He had good friends who didn't care what I did for work. They came over to play video games and never asked about my job. He still had moments where he was sensitive about people judging jobs, but overall he was resilient. The counselor said he was processing everything in a healthy way and recommended we reduce sessions to once a month. I agreed and scheduled the next appointment. The school board invited me to speak at their monthly meeting in late spring about the importance of respecting all professions and teaching kids about the dignity of work. It was nerve-wracking standing up there in front of all those officials and parents. I talked about how sanitation workers and mechanics and construction workers and other blue-collar jobs are essential and deserve respect. How kids learn their values from the adults around them, and teachers have a responsibility to model respect for all honest work. I kept it short and factual. Several board members thanked me afterward and said they appreciated my perspective. One of them asked if I'd be willing to participate in developing new curriculum materials about career education. I said I'd think about it. The district rolled out their new training program that summer. Every teacher had to attend a week-long workshop on discrimination and bias before school started in the fall. The principal sent me an email about it with the curriculum attached. They had whole sections on class bias and respecting different family backgrounds. One module was specifically about how teachers' attitudes toward blue-collar work can affect student self-esteem. I read through the materials and felt something shift in my chest. This wasn't just talk. They were actually teaching people why what happened to Tommy was wrong. The principal asked me to meet for coffee before the school year started. She told me my case had been a wake-up call for everyone in the district, said she'd been teaching and administering for 20 years and never really thought about how her own biases might show up in the classroom. The training materials quoted some of my testimony from the board meeting. Real policy changes were happening because we spoke up. Tommy asked me one Saturday morning if he could come to work with me. Said he wanted to see what I actually did all day. I checked with my supervisor, who said it was fine as long as Tommy wore a safety vest and stayed in the truck. Tommy was up before dawn that day, more excited than I'd seen him in months. We started the route at 6 and he watched everything. How I positioned the truck, how the hydraulic arms worked, how we sorted different materials. People waved at us from their windows and porches. One guy brought us coffee and thanked us for always being on time. Tommy kept saying how cool it was that everyone knew me and appreciated what I did. He asked a million questions about the truck mechanics and the route planning. When I dropped him off at his mom's house that afternoon, he ran inside talking about how efficient we were and how many tons of waste we collected. His mom texted me later that he'd told her friends about it on video chat without any embarrassment or hesitation. A year after the original career day, Tommy came home with a permission slip for another community helpers unit. My stomach dropped when I saw it. Tommy noticed my face and grabbed my hand. He said it would be different this time. Mr. Rodriguez had already asked him if I'd be willing to come back and present again. This time, the invitation came directly from the teacher with a personal note about how much the class would benefit from hearing about sanitation work. I signed the permission slip and marked the date on my calendar. The day arrived and I wore my uniform again. Mr. Rodriguez introduced me by my full name and actual job title. Told the class I was a sanitation worker who'd been serving their community for over a decade. The kids asked smart questions about recycling programs and environmental impact. They were genuinely interested and respectful. Tommy sat in the front row grinning the whole time. When I finished, he came up and hugged me in front of everyone. Said he was proud I was his dad. Life settled into a good rhythm after that. Tommy brought home report cards with good grades and stories about his friends. I still worked my roots, still made my $85,000 a year with benefits and pension. Mrs. Diane was gone. Her career finished because she'd built it on lies and treated people badly. Tommy and I came out stronger. We both learned that standing up against unfairness is worth it even when it's hard. My kid knows his dad fought for him and won. That matters more than anything else.